The Power of the Press by Richard Kearns. In the wry and poignant story that follows, we meet the debonair Gideon Upton, who picks up the evening paper and then takes a stroll through the park, a typical urban park filled with walking trees and living fountains, where two powerful sorcerers wage war with newspaper, buttons, and beer cans. A former editor of the SFWA Bulletin, Richard Kearns has published stories in Orbit 21, Dragons of Light, and Isaac Asimov's science fiction magazine. He lives in Beverly Hills, California. Old Willie had one newspaper left to sell before he closed up his stand for the night. It had been a clear, pleasant spring day, and all the smell of lilacs blooming in the park behind his newsstand had lingered in the air long after sundown, becoming somehow sweeter and fresher because of the chill that crept across town once the sun was gone. The stars overhead had come out quickly, putting on a spectacular display, red and blue-white and glittering like they hadn't done this side of winter. Nights like this, Willie didn't mind waiting to sell the last paper, though most of the theater crowd had been and gone by now. It was more of an excuse to stay out late and enjoy the evening. So he had another swig of whiskey from his flask, just to keep the cold away, and continued to wait, huddled in the warmth of his overcoat, and draped in the thin yellow light that fell from an old-fashioned granite-pillared street lamp next to his stand. He listened to the quiet settle in around town and heard different church bells toll 10 off in the distance. "Good evening, Willie." Willie jumped. "Oh, it's you, sir. Gave me quite a start there for a minute. I didn't hear you come up." "I'm sorry," said the second man. He was tall, well over 6 feet, and youngish. He wore what appeared to be a black overcoat, which was unbuttoned at the front and revealed a tuxedo within, but where the overcoat ended and night and shadow began was a difficult thing to say. There was a shapeless black hat sitting on his head, and the shadow of its brim cut across the man's face diagonally, making the one green eye that was left in the pale lamplight seem more alive than it should be. "Have you got a paper?" he asked. "Just one, sir. I should have known it would be you that came for it." The second man smiled. Not a normal smile, mind you, but a smile that was bright and wide and had good quantities of white teeth and sunlight in it. He took off his hat and pulled out a crisp new $20 bill, handing it to Willie. His hair was blond and curly and fairly long. "Keep the change," he said, putting his hat on again. "Use it to buy whiskey for cold evenings." Willie took the bill, chuckled, folded it in half, and stuck it in his overcoat pocket. "That I will, sir, and thank you very much." He gave the man the paper. "Evening Sun, too, just the way you like it, sir. You don't have to unfold 4 miles of paper to find out what's in the news, if you take my meaning. Not like the Trib." The second man took the paper, hefted it to determine its weight, flipped through the pages, and smiled again. "This will do fine, thank you," he said. Then he turned and walked toward the park entrance, his boots making crisp, gritty sounds against the quiet of the night. "I would be careful about going through the park if I was you, sir," Willie called out as he went about closing up. The second man stopped. "Really?" he asked. "Sure enough," said Willie. "It's been vandals and muggings something terrible this past month. Course there's a park patrol now," and here the hinges of the stand groaned as he swung the big metal doors shut, for what good they're worth. "A park patrol?" "Yes, sir, started just last week." Willie snapped the padlock shut and wiped his hands on his coat. "But they're new at it," he added, "and I don't know as I would trust 'em to keep me safe." "I shall remember that. Thank you." "Good night to you then, sir." "Good night, Willie." They headed in opposite directions. Now the second man's name was Gideon Upton, and he had been around, to say the least. He had certainly been to the park after dark before, although his purpose here tonight was quite different from his usual one. He was a very capable individual and managed to get himself into and out of more trouble than old Willie could ever imagine. Still, the information about the vandals and the park patrol disturbed him. He was thoughtful as he walked along the broad sidewalk that served as one of the park's main thoroughfares. Rows of elm trees on either side of him stretched their newly leaf-clad branches over his head. Their boughs met and meshed halfway across to form pointed archways, shutting out the moon and the stars above, and creating a cathedral hallway down the length of the walk. He passed street lamps like the one next to Willie's newsstand. These filled the avenue with a weak light, painting the scene in tones of yellow and gray, and heightening the shadows. The wrought-iron park benches that lived along the way were dour and disinclined to comment on the current situation. So Gideon kept walking. At first there were other footsteps, then a discreet cough. Gideon ignored both of these. What came next wasn't much of a surprise. "That will be far enough, Mr. Gideon Upton," a voice bellowed out from behind him. "That is you, isn't it?" Gideon stopped, but didn't turn around. "Supposing it was," he said. "What then?" "Why, then I would hope you'd come along peaceably," the voice answered. "You know better than to fight me in my own territory." Gideon laughed and turned where he stood. "But you hardly go anywhere else lately," he explained. In his left hand he held the evening sun rolled up, but from the fingers of his right hand now dangled a double page of the newspaper, hanging loosely in an upside-down V. "Hello, Jack," Gideon said. Jack was dressed in a military uniform, though there was hardly a square inch of cloth to be seen on him. His chubby form was covered head to toe, hat to boots, with brass buttons, gold braid, and a host of bright ribbons and medals that made him look like a cross between a lost galaxy and a sterling silver tea service. "It's General Jack tonight," he said, and saluted Gideon with a drawn sword. His paraphernalia clicked and clattered pleasantly in accompaniment to his motions. Gideon laughed again and returned the salute with his rolled-up newspaper. "General Jack of the Park Patrol. I'm impressed. What is it that you want with me?" "You're under arrest," said General Jack, visibly irritated. "I can't have you wandering all around the park like some vagrant now, can I?" "But I'm not wandering aimlessly," Gideon replied, gesturing with his arms, the darkness clinging to his coat and gathering behind him. "I've come to save the Lady Alice." "Ha! Then it's treason you're here for." "Well, I'd hardly call it that." "There's but one penalty for treason," cried General Jack, raising his sword over his head. "Death!" he screamed, and charged towards Gideon. Gideon had been waiting for that. He tossed the double page of newspaper into the air, and it beat its wings and screeched raucously, its print-filled pinions cutting through the night in a furious flight, its black eyes glistening, its beak sharp, its taloned feet strong and eager for pieces of the general's face. They didn't quite collide. The general stopped his headlong rush just in time, narrowly avoiding the eagle's inky claws on its first attack. His sword was in position, and he was ready as the bird made its second dive. General Jack swung his sword and cursed. The eagle swooped and screamed and ripped, and the air was quickly filled with metal buttons and shreds of newsprint. While the buttons fell to the ground, the pieces of newsprint formed themselves into tiny eagles and joined the fight, which put the general at quite a disadvantage. But he battled the eagle gnats aside with his free arm and kept slicing at the big eagle until he succeeded in cutting it nearly in half, at which point it fluttered helplessly to the ground, squawking. Its tiny companions rushed to its aid. Before they could join together and make themselves whole again, General Jack, dark blood oozing from scratches on his cheeks and forehead, quickly spoke a word. The paper burst into bright orange flames, spewing bits of ash that drifted aimlessly up and down the sidewalk. He didn't take his eyes off the pile until the fire went out, and twin streams of blue smoke curled up into the chilly night air. "Well," he said, to no one in particular, since Gideon was gone. "I can see I'm going to need some help with this one." He slid his sword back into its scabbard, hitched up his pants, dabbed at his face with a handkerchief, and began to pick up the buttons that had been torn from his uniform during the fight. Gideon came trotting up to Bastille Fountain with 2 freshly made newspaper panthers flanking him. They growled when he stopped and lashed their tails back and forth, standing guard. Overhead, the flapping newspaper wings could be heard. Gideon felt safe for the moment. He turned his attention to the fountain. Bastille Fountain wasn't fancy, but it was big. The main pool was a good 20 feet across. In the center, cement figures representing the 4 seasons, their features blurred and rust-stained, held a second basin suspended in midair. A lazy 4-foot water jet burbled and splashed inside of that, spilling wet curtains over the basin edge and sending slick streams down the fingers that gripped its ornamental rim, drenching the arms, faces, and dresses of the seasons below. Gideon leaned over the water. "Alice!" There was no answer, though strange ripples raced across the surface. He called a second time, slightly louder. "Alice!" Nothing. Gideon stood up straight. "Alice!" he yelled. "Damn you, woman! Wake up!" He dug into his coat pocket, pulled out a thick handful of coins, tossed them all at the raised pool. Some of them rang out briefly as they hit cement. Others, the majority actually, plopped as they fell into the water in both basins, a sound hardly distinguishable from the gurgle of the fountain. But the pillar of water moved now, turning, weaving, not quite stumbling, raising her hands gracefully to cover her face, while her hair, with a life of its own, cascaded out and down her back in black starlit ribbons. Her robe was a thing of sparkling white foam that tumbled into the waters of the inner pool. When she tried to gather up its skirts, she found them caught in the unyielding cement fingers of the seasons below. "Gideon!" Her voice was clear and sweet, and her bright blue eyes stared at him in surprise and distress. "Alice." "Gideon, help! I can't get out." "I know, my dear. I'm here to save you." He took a sheet of newspaper, folded it lengthwise, and changed it into a set of parapeted stairs that telescoped across the main pool and came to rest on the edge of Lady Alice's basin. General Jack finished pinning a scarlet cross for bravery above and beyond the call of duty during the Crimean War on the last of the 142 elm trees that lined the main walk. It had been a tedious task, making sure the correct button or medal was properly affixed to each trunk. The knowledge that Gideon was loose in the park and looking for the Lady Alice hadn't made things go any faster, either. He took his hat off, tucked it under his arm, and walked slowly to the center of the walk. In spite of the cool night air, a thin film of sweat covered his bald, egg-shaped head, and yellow highlights from the street lamps played across his features. He mopped at his face and the back of his neck with his handkerchief, then replaced his hat and drew his sword. "Troops!" he screamed. "Attention!" There were shadowy stirrings among the trees, and they untangled their branches over the walk, one from the other, destroying the leafy roof and letting the sky peep in overhead. "Fall in!" Now there was a rumbling and churning among the tree roots as knobby feet dug their way out of the ground, scattering black clods of dirt in every direction. The trees clambered onto the sidewalk slowly, but without any hint of clumsiness. The main impressions they gave off were ones of strength and immense weight. Their buttons and medals glittered balefully in the night. General Jack, his arms crossed over his chest, the unsheathed sword held upright in his right hand, waited patiently until they formed 4 straight rows on the sidewalk. "At ease, trees," he said. "Now listen up. There's an enemy in the park. Your mission tonight is to find him and keep him from doing any mischief. Take whatever measures you think necessary, but I want him alive." And here the general paused and ran his thumb across his sword blade to check its sharpness. "So I can deal with him myself." He paused again and then yelled out, "Do you understand that, trees?" "Yes, sir," the trees yelled back. "I can't hear you," screamed the general. "Yes, sir," the trees screamed back. "I still can't hear you," he shouted. "Yes, sir." "All right, now who is your leader?" "General Jack." "And who do you fight for?" "General Jack." "And who do you die for?" "General Jack." "And who do we fight?" "The enemy, sir." "And what is his name?" "Gideon, sir." "Let's hear it again." "Gideon, sir." "One more time." "Gideon, sir." "And what do we do to him? Kill him?" "No." "Maim him?" "Yes." "Torture him, bruise him, and scrape him?" "Yes." "Tie him up, stop him, detain him?" "Yes." "Forward! March! Forward! March! Forward! March!" They shrumped off into the distance. "Oh, Gideon," said the Lady Alice, "hurry, please. I can't bear it any longer." She frantically tugged at the section of her glowing dress, still pinned by a last cement hand. This only made Gideon stop working with his newspaper crowbar, because the material got in the way. "I'm not going to save you if you keep acting like this," he told her, in an even tone, trying not to succumb to the tension he felt. General Jack should have shown up a good 15 minutes ago, or at least run into one of the traps Gideon had set along the way. But he had done neither, and Gideon could feel tremors of his magic at work in the park. Dismayed, Alice let fall the skirts she had gathered up in her arms, and they splashed in the fountain waters, nearly dousing Gideon. "I'm sorry," she said. "It's all right." He went back to work on the fingers, muttering spells, or at least something that sounded like spells, and prying with the crowbar. Alice knelt and hugged her knees, wanting to watch his work more closely. But she ended up studying Gideon's face, his delicate, fine-boned features, his lips normally thin and now compressed into a determined line, the 3 blonde curls that had crept out from under his hat to become stuck in the sweat on his forehead, the way his green eyes glittered with spell-kindled fires. She reached out and took his hat off. "I really am sorry," she said. "I said it was all right," he snarled back, snatching his hat from her and putting it on again. He started pushing harder on the crowbar, trying to ignore her. "Now you're angry with me," she said, taking his hat away again. "No!" he roared, loosening 2 of the cement fingers but dropping the crowbar in the water at the same time, where it reverted to a sheet of wet newspaper. He grabbed at the hat, but Alice hid it behind her back. "Tell me you're not angry with me," she said. Gideon glared at her. "I'm not angry with you," he said between clenched teeth. "Now give me back my hat." She kissed him instead. Her kiss was cool and sweet and fresh, and Gideon, after his initial surprise, drank deeply of it. In it he could taste the bubbling cold of far-off mountain streams, hints of peppermint and clove and sassafras, the elusive flavor of honeysuckle, rose, and the darker, heavier essences of wild blackberry and grape. He had been furious with Alice at first, but then he quickly abandoned himself in her kiss. And once he did that, he felt the fear and worry drain out of him, leaving behind only confidence, composure, and a renewed strength. It took him a second to realize the kiss had ended. When he did, he threw back his head and laughed loud and long until the tears dripped out of his eyes. The Lady Alice smiled when she saw Gideon had recovered his senses and put his hat on her own head. "That's much more like it," she told him. Gideon wiped the tears away with his coat sleeve. "Ah, you should have done that sooner, Alice." She grinned at him. His hat was far too large for her, and made her look like a thin pixie. Everything has its moment, I suppose. Her blue eyes sparkled with amusement. "I've missed you, Alice." "And I you. Make me a promise." "What?" "When we get out of here." "You mean if we get out of here." He gingerly fished the newspaper out of the water, turned it back into a soggy crowbar, and began wringing water from it. "When we get out of here," she said firmly. She pushed the hat back on her forehead and rested her hands on her knees, her elbows jutting out at odd angles. "When we get out of here, let's go away together." Gideon frowned. "Where?" "Does it matter?" "Well, it's just that we've been everywhere there is to go away to." "Really?" Gideon applied the crowbar to the remaining cement fingers, but it bent because it was still too wet. "Try thinking of a place we haven't been," he said, forcing the crowbar back into its proper shape. "Paris. We were there last fall." "But I like Paris." "Everybody goes to Paris." He changed the crowbar into a bicycle pump. "Pick someplace else." "How about Egypt?" "It's flooding along the Nile now," he said, working the pump vigorously and sending a weak stream of water out the end of the hose into the pool below. "The peasants are all being farmers, and we'd only get in the way." "New Orleans?" "Too late. We'll have missed the Mardi Gras this year, and that's the only time it's worth going." "Tibet, then?" "Nope." He shook the pump, heard water sloshing inside it still, and examined the open end of the air tube. "We went there at the turn of the century. You hated it. It was either too hot or too cold. The only reason you don't remember is you caught Tibetan fever, and I had to haul you all the way to Ceylon before you recovered." "Oh." She stood up. "But don't let that stop you. Try some other places." Gideon changed the bicycle pump into a walking stick, unscrewed the cap, and poured more water out. "Why don't you just make a new one?" she asked him, grumpily. "You've got enough fresh paper." "Waste not, want not," he answered. "And I'm not sure I have enough to waste. We still have to make an exit once I get you loose." He looked up at her and smiled. "You're not giving up so quickly, are you?" "No." "Then let me help," he told her, screwing the top back on the cane and sticking it under his arm so he could count on his fingers. "Should I start with continents or bodies of water?" "Oh, stop being so boring." "All right, continents then. That would be Africa, Asia, Australia." "I have it!" "Australia? No, not there." She knelt and took his hands in hers. "I've heard it said that the night is an uncharted ocean," she began. Gideon looked at the sky doubtfully. "You're mad," he mumbled, shaking his head. "Stark, raving mad." "But Gideon, just think of it. If the night is an ocean, then the moon must surely be a beautiful island," she said, standing up and beginning a dance of delight, whirling in slow circles, her arms outstretched. "And the stars like fishes." "Fishes?" "Oh, yes, Gideon, and we'll bring the purple ones back with us to Avalon." And here she became so tangled in her dress where the cement fingers held it that she stopped dancing and started tugging again. But even as she did so, a horrified look came over her face. All right, I'll get it loose." "Gideon." "What?" "Gideon, the trees are moving." Gideon looked over his shoulder and saw the burnt pavement and drifting ash that marked what was left of his sentinels, and then swore. The southern half of the square around Bastille Fountain was quickly filling with cold, silent, walking elm trees. At the back of the ranks, Gideon spotted a small, shining figure that could only have been General Jack. He threw his walking stick at the figure, and the stick swiftly whizzed through the air as if it had been shot from a bow, hitting the general with a satisfying thud and an accompanying oof. Gideon leapt from the inner pool and hit the ground rolling so he could dodge the clutching branches of the nearest trees. He sprinted toward the open end of the square, and holding what remained of the evening sun perpendicular to the ground, wrapped a newspaper castle walls around himself. Walls that seemed to leap into the sky, reaching for the stars towering over the turmoil. It is unfortunate that Gideon wasn't inside when the transformation was complete. It wasn't his fault, of course. It was the fault of one particularly surly elm tree, pinned with the Scarlet Cross for bravery above and beyond the call of duty during the Crimean War. A potent medal, to be sure. This crafty, battle-wise tree had entered the open square on the northern side, crept up behind Gideon unnoticed as he jumped from the fountain, and plucked him off his castle ramparts as they shot heavenward. The other trees were quick to grasp the situation, and, since each tree wanted to be the one to turn the enemy over to General Jack, they all converged on Gideon and began a tug-of-war with him. General Jack, downed as he was by the flying cane, couldn't get to the scene in time to take control of the situation, so what followed wasn't strictly his fault. Different contingents of trees had a hold of different parts of Gideon, his arms, his legs, his head, and when the general came hobbling up, bellowing commands indiscriminately, they all gave one last tug, one final effort to lay victory at the feet of their beloved leader. Gideon came apart in their hands. He came apart in dusty reams, in chunks of faded yellow Tribune, in heaps of brittle Post-Dispatches, in wads of Manchester Guardians, Philadelphia Bulletins, Miami Heralds, and New York Times. Most of them early morning editions. When this happened, Gideon's castle wavered and fell, snowing pages of the evening sun everywhere. Silence set in, broken only by the sound of water splashing in Lady Alice's fountain. The trees lined up in awkward, embarrassed rows, trying not to notice the sea of paper in which they were wading, but looking very guilty all the same. General Jack just stood there, leaning on Gideon's cane. He stared at the trees, stared at the litter of papers, glanced briefly but contemptuously at the Lady Alice, and then stared at the paper some more. He poked at the mess with the cane and cleared his throat. "Listen up, trees," he said. "There's nothing that can be done about this now." He stuck his chin out proudly and surveyed his troop. "But there is one big job we've got to finish before we can quit for the night." The trees murmured excitedly among themselves. General Jack pulled a brass button off his uniform. "I want it all cleaned up," he told them, tossing the button to one side, where it exploded in a puff of smoke and left a green wire mesh trash can. Every scrap, every shred, and another button produced another can. Every page, every tiny piece, even if it's confetti-sized, I want it all. 2 cans at once this time. We can't afford to miss anything that would let our enemy escape. He tossed off a final 3 buttons with a flourish, and they thundered in a 3-can grand finale. "Got it?" The trees either mumbled or nodded their assent. "Then get to it!" he screamed, and the trees immediately bent over to start picking up the paper, the majority of them bumping into one another in the process. General Jack avoided the ensuing confusion by limping over to the fountain with Gideon's cane. "Good evening," he said, tipping his hat to the Lady Alice. "I must say you are looking quite beautiful tonight." Alice ignored him, her arms folded across her chest. "Look, Alice, I can understand your being upset about all this, but it was really for the best." Still no answer. "He was beneath you, Alice." Alice stared down at the general, her eyes a chill, icy blue. "Really?" she said. The general smiled. "Why, yes, of course. He never would have been good enough for you. He just couldn't cut it, I guess." "And I suppose you are good enough for me?" "The best, Alice." He thumped his chest. "Solid brass." "Well, let me tell you something, Jack. I will kill you for what you've done to Gideon tonight." "Oh?" "Yes. Oh. I will call my beasts from the pits of the ocean, have them hunt you down, and then cheerfully throttle you with my own hands." The general chuckled, thinly, nasally, and conceitedly. "I think not, my dear," he said, twirling Gideon's cane in his fingers. "You will come around to my way of seeing things eventually. In fact," he added, debonairly thumping the cane onto the pavement, "I was hoping this little episode tonight would make you realize how untenable your situation is." He leaned on the cane with both hands, his right leg jauntily crossed over his left, and foot balanced toe first on the ground. "You are beginning to realize that, aren't you?" A large wave rose suddenly from the bottom basin and doused the general. "I hope you rust," she told him. "You know, Alice," the general said, dripping, "I am rapidly losing my patience with you." "Not rapidly enough," Alice answered. "Perhaps you're right." General Jack studied Gideon's cane thoughtfully for a moment. Suddenly, he tossed it into the air, making it spin with a flick of his wrist. Alice lunged for it desperately as it passed her, missing and falling to her knees. The general caught the cane just before it fell into the bottom pool. "Missed," he said, and staring straight at her, he smiled and, without turning his gaze from her face, let the cane drop into the water, where it transformed into a sheet of newspaper again. The Lady Alice struggled to her feet. "There is nothing left to change him back with now," the general told her. "You could have bargained for his life, you know. Nothing to say to that?" He smiled again. "Good, very good. Perhaps you are beginning to realize the futility of your position." He turned his back on her and rejoined his trees, although he still favored one leg slightly as he went. He spoke briefly to the elm with the scarlet cross, tossed a button toward the fountain, where it exploded into a waste can, and watched as the tree fished the newspaper out of the fountain waters. The tree looked as if he might have said something to Alice, but evidently thought better of it when he saw the stern look on her face. He shrugged and continued to help with the cleanup. The moon set, leaving the stars to fend for themselves. After carefully collecting the last scraps of Gideon they could find, the elm troops had lined up all 8 trash cans in a row and then marched off victoriously with General Jack in the lead. The Lady Alice, of course, was neither fooled nor amused by this tactic. She had waited a good 3 hours, patiently watching the shadows in the foliage behind the trash cans, before the shadow that didn't belong stepped out into the square, its scarlet cross for bravery above and beyond the call of duty during the Crimean War glowing softly in the dark. "Seen enough?" Alice asked. The tree regarded her for a moment, apparently considering her question. Then he lumbered over to the trash cans and mashed down the paper in each one securely. When he finished that, he looked back at Alice, grinned at her arrogantly, stretched his scrawny-leafed spring-green limbs, and shuffled down the west walk to join his squadron. As soon as he was out of sight, Alice knelt and whispered 5 words. "Now bring him to me." The water at her feet and in the basin below boiled strangely, sending clouds of steam drifting in the night air. Crabs came scuttling out, hundreds of copper-colored filler crabs, none of them more than 3 inches across. They either flung themselves over the edge of the top pool, or crept quietly out of the bottom pool, moving across the fountain square with remarkable speed for their size. Alice had made them out of the coins Gideon had tossed in her fountain, the first workable materials she'd had since the general had trapped her in the fountain. She watched, her heart pounding as the first wave of crabs reached the trash cans and began climbing. Clutched to her breast was Gideon's hat, warm and dry and hidden by the folds of her gown. It was his last chance, the hat. The crabs were to bring enough newspaper over to the fountain for her to restore him with it. The plan would have worked, too, except that the trash cans were enchanted. Or perhaps it would be more accurate to say that the trash cans were singularly devoid of enchantment. As soon as the first crabs passed over the rim of a can, they would fall inside, pennies once again. The crabs following what were now pennies were nobody's fools. As soon as they saw what had happened to their fellow crustaceans, they stopped in their tracks and began to warn the others in high-pitched, rasping voices. In no time at all, confusion, accompanied by miniature squeals of consternation, spread through the ranks. Crabs began leaping and falling off the trash cans into the masses below. Waves of crabs, still coming up from the rear, folded over waves of crabs that were milling and arguing with one another until there were crabs 5 layers thick in some places. Little crab leaders stood on the tops of little shifting crab hills and screamed for attention over the rising tide of shrill babble. The Lady Alice swore. "This isn't the time for a debate," she said. "Bring him to me." The crab's response was immediate. They attacked 2 of the trash cans, trying to knock them over. Their actions were not very well coordinated, however. As often as one group of crabs would get a can rocking, another group, working at cross purposes to the first, would negate the momentum the first group had set up. Alice endured this as long as she could. She watched the empty walks, half expecting to see dark shapes moving through the shadows toward her. "Hurry up," she whispered, stamping her foot in frustration. "Get him over here now." A contingent of crabs, maybe a third of the entire group, broke away from the flurry of activity around the first 2 cans and headed for a third can. The wishes of the Lady Alice were clear to them. If they couldn't get Gideon's papers to her, they would have to get a canful of Gideon to her. The screech of metal on cement ripped through the quiet night, 2, 3, 4 times every time the crabs moved the can forward. Alice wailed unhappily. Before, there had been a chance to quietly restore Gideon and escape without the general or any of his trees the wiser. Now, though, the general and whatever else was awake in the park would be sure to come and investigate the strange noise. It was almost as if they had set off an alarm. There was nothing else that they could do now. Alice drew out Gideon's hat, half afraid it would revert to newspaper as soon as the night air hit it. The hat held, and she got ready to throw it. The seconds drained away slowly, punctuated by the shrieking can. The crabs managed to get it more than halfway across the fountain square, still a good 20 feet away from Alice. The first 2 cans were rocking violently. That was when Alice heard footsteps to her left. Giant, pavement-shattering footsteps. Smaller, quicker, pattering footsteps, and an accompanying military bellow that was very familiar to her. She didn't even look to confirm what she knew. She threw the hat. And everything began to happen very quickly. Even as she threw Gideon's hat, the first set of cans tipped over like dominoes, one making the other fall, both of them sending papers scattering across a wider area than seemed possible, had they been normal papers. General Jack and the elm with the crimson cross entered Bastille Square from the east. They both saw Gideon's hat wafting through the air on a slow, perfect arc. The general slowed down, pointed, and screamed a command, while the tree moved quickly to intercept the hat. He missed. His twigs whipped through the empty air as the hat landed in the trash can, sitting there for a second, before the papers underneath it started quivering. The elm got 2 steps closer. A reconstituted Gideon shot out of the garbage can, past the arms of the surprised elm, and landed, rolling, in the litter of papers that the crabs had managed to spill out of the first 2 trash cans. He sat there, dazed, for perhaps another second, then scrambled to his feet, raised his hands, and sang out his own words of power in a melodious voice. A sail arched up before him, 50 feet tall, triangular, paisley-patterned, purple, gold, and translucent, and billowing and snapping as it filled with a sudden wind. The varnished brown bows of a wooden ship surrounded Gideon, the crabs, and the now empty waste cans, carrying all of them forward and up, slowly and inexorably up. They knocked the elm tree over and sent him rolling, and still they climbed up, their rounded keel almost 10 feet in the air, their timbers creaking as they gained speed and altitude. General Jack chanted counterspells, making orange sparks swirl all around the ship. Gideon looked for a weapon. His magic was invested in the rising ship, and there was nothing left for fighting. Desperate, he took 2 steps aft, picked up an empty trash can, and heaved it over the side. The general was caught completely by surprise. The trash can came falling over him, top down, and pinned him flat. There was an electric flash, and his torso reverted to aluminum beer cans. His arms and legs were splayed outside the can after it came to rest upside down, and his hatless head went slowly rolling away from the sight of his body. And that was that. Gideon brought the golden bulk of the night bird to rest, 3 feet away from the edge of the inner pool. The ship's single giant sail ripped serenely in the quieted wind. It cast faint shadows in the starlight on the ground below. He dropped an anchor into the bottom pool, placed a boarding plank between the boat and the edge of the fountain, picked out a particularly sturdy-looking stave, and walked over to Alice. "Shall we?" he asked, holding his arm out for her after he had broken the final cement fingers of winter. Alice smiled at him, kissed him on the cheek, took his arm, and said, "I believe we shall." They boarded the ship. "Well," she said, seeing all the stacks of newspaper neatly bundled and stored on the deck, "I see you've provisioned for a long escape. Actually, I had hoped we could go away together." "Really?" "Of course, I wouldn't fib about something like that." Alice giggled. "Where, then?" she asked, stroking the night bird's balustrade. "I'm not sure," said Gideon, "but there are these rumors." "Rumors?" "Yes, I've heard it said that the night is an uncharted ocean." "And that the moon must be like a beautiful island?" "Yes." "And the stars like fishes?" "Yes, yes." The Lady Alice played with Gideon's lapels. "You can't believe everything you hear, you know." "No, but it seems to me we ought to find out the truth of the matter for ourselves." She hugged him. "I love you, Gideon." "I love you too, Alice. Otherwise—" "Help!" cried a voice from below. "Help! Help!" Gideon and Alice furrowed their eyebrows at each other, slightly puzzled, then ran to the starboard bow to investigate. It was General Jack's head that had cried out for help. It lay face up in the middle of a constellation of bright copper pennies, 10 feet away from the reach of the fallen elm. "You can't leave me here like this," pleaded the head. Gideon laughed. "I do believe you're right," he said, and then jumped over the side. Once on the ground, he righted the trash can, threw in General Jack's arms and legs, and then walked over to the head. "What are you going to do?" asked the head. "What do you think I ought to do?" asked Gideon in return. "You were perfectly willing to finish me off." The head didn't answer. Gideon frowned at it and then looked up at the night bird. "Alice?" There was silence for a space. "Let him go, Gideon," she said softly. "I wish I could tell you to get rid of him, but let him go." Gideon glared at Jack's head in his hand. "And I, for my part," he said, "wish she wasn't right." Tossing the head into the waiting arms of the elm tree, he then walked over to the trash can, dumped out the clattering beer cans, and swept them into a neat pile with his feet. The trash can went into the fountain next, where it sizzled, popped, and turned into a brass button. "Goodbye, Jack," said Gideon, waving at the tree. "See you round sometime." Jack didn't answer. Alice lowered a rope for Gideon to climb back to the ship. They weighed anchor and disappeared quickly into the darkness. "Well," said the head, after the night bird was gone, "let's not just sit here. Hurry up and toss me on my pile of cans. There's work that needs to be doing before morning gets here." The elm took aim as best it could, and Jack made it after only one bounce. He buried himself in cans quickly, huffing and puffing and rattling with exertion once he was out of sight. He finally came crawling out from under the far side of the pile, whole once more, but changed. He was shorter, and his uniform, while still a tribute to the timelessness of brass and chrome and glitter, was of a decidedly different cut. Jack seated himself on the ground, legs askew, his back against the cement rim of Bastille Fountain, took a deep breath and blew it out in relief. He picked up a stray beer can, negligently changed it into a handkerchief, and mopped his face, forehead, and neck. Stuffing the handkerchief up his sleeve, he leaned back and looked around him. The general's cap lay a couple feet to his right. He stared at it a bit, grunted, leaned on his elbow and stretched over to it, barely able to reach it and draw it to him. He held the cap up in front of his face and studied it. "The army was a good life," he said, glancing at the elm tree and then back at the cap. "Pity it wasn't good enough." He tossed the cap, which went rolling across Bastille Square, coming to a stop when it bumped up against an overturned trash can. Jack leaned to his left and dug into what remained of his pile of cans. "The Navy, though," he said, pulling a three-cornered admiral's hat out of the pile, "offers many, many more possibilities." He frowned at the hat a moment. "We'll have to raid a junkyard or two," he said, grabbing a can and changing it into a brilliant purple feather, "until we have enough supplies on hand." He stuck the plume on the admiral's hat, then fitted the hat on his head. You can never really have enough raw materials. He struggled to his feet, straightened his jacket, stood up as tall as he could, and then blew the feather out of his face. "But first," he said, turning a critical eye to the elm tree with the Crimson Cross for bravery above and beyond the call of duty during the Crimean War, "there remains the matter of a proper ship." Old Willie loved to walk through the park at dawn before he opened his newsstand for the day. There was something eerie and beautiful and utterly private about the park when the sun first came up, particularly during the spring. Maybe it was the way the long golden sunbeams gilded the dew that had collected in all sorts of unlikely places overnight. Or perhaps it was the songs the newly arrived birds sang, or the fresh smells and colors from different just-opened blossoms and leaves that had been non-existent the day before. Whatever the circumstances, Willie felt like the park was full of quiet miracles made just for him when he walked through every morning. Today, though, he saw nothing but ruin when he came through Bastille Square. Broken manches, scattered change, and beer cans everywhere. It made the play of water in the Bastille fountain seem harsh and out of place, like it was the wonder that didn't belong, rather than the mess. Well, he thought, there was no help for it. The park patrol would find the vandals eventually, and there was nothing to do but wait until that happened. Just as he was about to leave the fountain square, he spotted an odd glimmering near a cluster of trash cans on the other side. Investigating, he found an old military hat buried in a pile of yesterday's papers. The hat was covered with pins and medals and badges, most of which Willie had never seen the likes of before. "Well now," he said, polishing the hat with his coat sleeve and then trying it on, "ain't that something?" It wasn't a perfect fit, but it was close enough. He decided to keep the hat. He whistled a cheerful tune all the rest of the way to his newsstand.